Well, I was going to cover some of the. I was going to cover what we had planned today. The topic was going to be what external standards should be included in a submission and why. But unfortunately, all my notes somehow disappeared somewhere on my desk. So I'm going to try to do this from memory, but I apologize if I'm not quite as organized as normal here. So, first of all, um, when we posted this as a topic that we were going to cover today for the live YouTube video, I had uh, I had let people know we're going to cover two things. Number one, what external standards should you be including in a 510K submission, and what external standards should you be including in a CE marking submission or technical file? And one of the people that had seen the announcement about this sent me back a great question. They said, well, the common specifications are supposed to be on a declaration of conformity for a submission, but they weren't sure about the external, what other recognized standards or harmonized standards should be included on there. And they had also heard that those standards could be included in an appendix. And they weren't sure if it had to be part of the Declaration of Conformity as a standalone document or it had to be included in the submission. So I'm going to address that question first. So yes, the Declaration of Conformity should be a standalone document. Yes, the Annex 4 of the MDR says you shall include the common specifications in the Declaration of Conformity, but it doesn't say the harmonized standards. It says just the common specifications. There are some notified bodies that want you to also include the harmonized standards, and they expect the harmonized standards list to be included in the technical file somewhere. So if your device has common specifications, you would include those in your Declaration of Conformity. If your notified body requires you include the harmonized standards as well, you're going to have to include those as well. It's up to the notified body what their requirements are for a Declaration of Conformity for format and content. But it can't be less than what's in Annex 4. It can be more than, but it can't be less than. And when we say appendix, if you have it as a second page to the Declaration of Conformity, you're appending it to the declaration, which is on the first page, and that's sufficient. And if you had a very long list of harmonized standards that you were providing as part of that Declaration of Conformity, that would make perfect sense. But if you only have a common specification or one or two standards that you're claiming are harmonized standards that you're complying with, then you can probably put it all on one page. Other things that I've seen as a second page to a Declaration of Conformity are a long list in tabular format of all the devices that are covered under that declaration, because a lot of companies will have one declaration that will cover many devices. For instance, if you had a suture company, think of all the different gauges of sutures, all the different styles of sutures, barbed, unbarbed, or smooth, different lengths, one's with needle, one without needles, some with needles on both ends. You get the idea. It could be an enormous number just because all the different configurations of that simple product, a suture. So when you write a Declaration of Conformity, yes, Annex 4 requires that you include the common specifications. You can have it appended as a second page, but it shouldn't be in an appendix of the technical file. The technical file should have a Declaration of Conformity in it, and the common specs have to be in, or CS documents have to be included in that. So the harmonized standards, that's up to you and your notified body where you put those. But if you choose to put it in your Declaration of Conformity, you're probably going to have it on the second page. So I think that kills that question completely. Now, what if you have a technical file? What standards do you have to include in there? So European notified bodies don't really care about the FDA standards or FDA requirements. They care about the European requirements. So if there is an EN standard, you should reference the EN standard, and you should reference the current version. That's different from the FDA's perspective, and I'm going to cover the FDA's perspective in a moment. But for a technical file submission that's going to a notified body for European CE marking, you want to specify standards that are European standards whenever possible, and always the current version, and they expect you to be compliant with the most current version. And if the standard gets changed, you have to change with it. And that means creating a quality plan, retesting, and it's possible you might even have to redesign your product to comply with the new testing requirements. That's part of the requirements for Europe, and that's part of what they mean when they say, does it comply with state of the art? State of the art is whatever the most current specification is or standard is for the testing. And these standards are often created for a reason, because over time we learn about different safety hazards and come up with better ways of controlling those risks and reducing risks. So you need to comply with them. Now, which harmonized standards should you list is really what I wanted to nail down for you. When you are listing harmonized standards, there is a difference between the harmonized standards for a specific technical file and product code or product versus harmonized standards that might be listed in your essential requirements checklist, or if you're already compliant with the MDR, the GSPRs, or general safety and performance regulations. So those are Annex 1, regardless whether it's MDD or MDR, it's still Annex 1. And in there, when they have a quality system requirement, you list ISO 13485. When it's a risk management requirement, you list 14971. Neither one of those have any testing requirements. So, yes, you do have to comply with them. Yes, you're going to list them in the Annex 1 checklist, whether it's ERC or GSPR, but those aren't harmonized standards that you are doing any testing to. So when you're doing a technical file review, you can put those in there, but you don't have to. They need to be listed in the essential requirements checklist, but they don't necessarily need to be listed as one of the things that you're claiming conformity to for your Declaration of Conformity. You're already saying that you have an ISO certificate. Otherwise, you wouldn't have a CE certificate. So in these declarations, you're listing your certificates. So there's no need for that additional line item that says, 1340 EN ISO 1345 2016 Amendment 2021. That's not necessary. If you want to put it in there, put it in there, but you're not going to actually show anything other than that certificate. For the 14971, also no testing requirements in there. It's documentation requirements in a risk management file that are included in your technical file. It's not a testing standard. Another example that's similar to that, if you have, trying to think, 62366 is the usability standard. So you have to have a usability engineering file, but you don't necessarily have any testing requirements that are specific in there. That standard doesn't tell you what to test. It tells you how to document the risks and how to document your risk controls. There is some usability testing that you would do, but there's not a standard that has prescriptive requirements for the testing. So this is another one we probably wouldn't include in there. The things that would typically be included there are things that have testing requirements. So instead of listing ISO 10993-1 for the biocompatibility overarching standard, you would list instead the tests that are underneath that, which would be the -5 for cytotoxicity, the -10 for irritation and sensitization. So it's the testing requirements that we're looking for. If you have a surgical instrument, you might list a standard for the titanium or something like that, that you did testing for, analytical testing to make sure the C of A for that titanium met the requirements for that standard. So there are a lot of things that are standards that we follow that are quality system requirements. There are some that are higher level that are going to cover like biocompatibility and what endpoints you need to consider, but the testing standards are usually what they're looking for. So include the testing standards for packaging, include the testing standards for sterilization, include the testing standards for material strength or something like that. If it's an electronic device, you're particular standards for that device in your electrical safety and your EMC testing. So these are the things that you want to include there. But always an EN standard, if you can, you have to include the common specifications. But these higher level ones, a lot of times we'll leave those out of there because there are many quality system requirements, like and you just wouldn't typically include those. If you do include those, then you have additional requirements. So this is why we often recommend leaving them out. People are like, "Well, just put it in there." Even though it's not a testing standard, put it in there anyway. Well, think about it for a second. You have to claim whether you, for every single standard you claim compliance with, and you put in your declaration of conformity or your list of harmonized standards, you have to say whether you comply in full or only partially. And for ISO 1345, I know very few companies that comply with all of it because some of it's not applicable to their device. So if you're going to follow the method that's required here, you're going to have to say, well, if I claim 1345, then I have to say what clauses of 1345 I comply with, because I don't comply with the standard in full. Is that something you really want to do in your declaration of conformity or in your harmonized standards list? No. You want to be ideally claiming full compliance. And if you're not, then you're going to have a table and says, here's the standard. And then next to it, you're going to indicate what clauses are applicable and which ones aren't. And you're going to have to provide justifications why. So the goal here isn't to bury the person with as many standards as you can think of that might apply to your device. It's to try to list only those standards that really are required for that device, that you have testing results in. You actually can show, I passed this test. This is compliant with this testing. So that's what you're trying to do, is just the testing standards that are required. And if you're not sure what those are, you can try proposing a list to your notified body and say, is this an acceptable list of standards, or have we missed some that we're required to comply with? They're not telling you how to design your device, so it's not advice. You're giving them a draft of your declaration of conformity or your harmonized standards list and asking if you forgot one, or if they feel that that's acceptable. Thank you for the chat questions. What about 62304? So that's a great question. 62304 is a standard that doesn't have really prescriptive requirements on how to do the testing. You have to write your own protocols for the testing to 62304. So usually we don't have compliance with 62304 as a requirement in there. But if you have a software device, what standards are you going to have? You don't have any prescriptive testing standards. So I have seen some declarations where they'll put the 62304 in there and say, we comply with this standard. The other ones, they won't. So in your essential requirements, when they get to software, you're definitely going to be putting 62304 in there. And you're going to have to indicate whether you comply in full or just parts of it. But be careful about saying, this is my harmonized standards list, and putting every single standard you can think of down there. If you have a software device, it does make sense to put down 62304 because there's really no other standards to put down for a software device. And if it's software as a medical device, that's probably the only standard you might have. There are some other ones that are on the, should I include 15223-1? Yeah, I would probably include that if I comply with that full standard. And that's one of the things they expect, is you have applied the European standard for symbols. And if you don't include some of the symbols, explain why. So that is something that they would expect in there. But there aren't any testing requirements in there. So that's not something I would normally put in a declaration of conformity. That's not something I would normally list as one of the harmonized standards. But it is something that I would put under labeling. So when I get down to the section Annex 1 in section 23, it's asking for, it gives you the different labeling requirements, and I would list that standard as how we complied with some of the labeling requirements. But there's, once again, no testing requirements in there. So Usually, when a notified body is asking for a harmonized standards list, I try to just give them the ones that are for testing. And if I have a software device, I probably am going to have to include 6304 because I don't have any other software testing requirements. But I could see even potentially trying to leave that out of that list because it doesn't have any specific testing requirements. So they're really not clear on what should be included and what shouldn't be included. But if you include everything that's in your essential requirements list, you're going to have some non-product specific things that are quality system requirements. And that 62304 standard, it's in between. It has some quality system requirements because you have to have a software quality system, but at the same time, it has requirements in there for identifying what the classification of your device is. Is it a Class A, a Class B, a Class C, and what kinds of documentation you have to include for each one. So I could certainly see companies including that one, but I could also see people making an argument for it doesn't have any specific testing requirements. It's more of a quality system, software quality system documentation. So I'm not going to include it. Some of these are on the fence, and it's hard to decide and give you a really straight answer. Yes, you have to. No, you don't. I've seen it both ways with different notified body auditors. So, what happens when you go to the US? What do they require? So, if you have referenced one of the recognized standards that the FDA has, and they may not be the most current standard, they definitely are not going to include European standards in there. They're only going to require international standards or US standards. So ANSI/AAMI standards, ASTM standards, USP standards, CLIA standards, and ISO standards, IEC standards. Those are what are going to be covered under the FDA's recognized standards. They actually have a link for it that I'm going to put down below in the description of this video. I'm going to actually provide the link for the US requirements for recognized standards. But when you put those in there, you need to make sure you've got the most recent one that the FDA recognizes. During transition periods, they'll list two of them so that you'll have one. Here's the old standard and here's the new one. So during that transition period, you can claim compliance with either one. After the transition period, the old one will go away. And they give you multiple options in many cases for which version are you claiming compliance with, but you can't put in an EN standard and say that we're complying with this and then reference the US version. They are different. So you've got to make a decision. Am I claiming compliance with the recognized US version, or am I claiming compliance with the EN version they don't recognize? You always want to be claiming compliance with the US version. Now, if your testing was not done to that standard, now you're stuck in a position where you have to figure out, are there any differences between the two standards? And you have to provide some sort of a gap analysis or comparison between the two versions, the European version, the US version, and explain why your testing is acceptable. Now, maybe there are no differences that affect your testing. Maybe there are differences. You have to know, and you have to demonstrate that to the FDA. So the goal here, once again, is not to claim every single possible standard you can. It's to claim the ones that you need to that have testing requirements for that product. When you look on the FDA website for a 3-letter product code, it will actually list specific standards they expect you to consider. So that list, you either need to identify, yes, we comply with this, and we comply in full or in part. And if you are not complying in full, or then you're going to have to provide an actual declaration of conformity explaining how you comply with that and which parts of it you comply with. And if you are just referencing in general, that's also possible. So then you're just going to include the full test report and say that we're referencing this as a general standard, but we provided the full test report explaining how we did this. For 62304, that can be somewhat challenging because when you say, we're going to provide the full test reports, you can have literally thousands of pages of testing that you're providing here. So that makes for a very large submission when you include all testing reports for software. Normally, what people will do is they will comply with the FDA guidance document for software, and they will provide exactly what documentation the FDA has requested for each of those. And some of them, they're only asking for summaries. Some of them, if you have a minor level of concern device, they're not even asking for anything. So be careful that the goal here, when you are providing a list of standards, is these are the test reports that we put in section 14 through 20 for the 510K. And here are the standards that are referenced, that are recognized by the FDA. And we're saying either we comply with them in full and providing the test reports, or we're not complying in full, and then we're providing a declaration of conformity. And if you're doing a special 510K or an abbreviated 510K, then you're going to have to write a detailed summary of those test results. So you indicate the standard, you indicate the methods used, so provide a summary of the protocol that was done, the acceptance criteria, the justification for the sample sizes, and a summary of the results of the testing. So those would be the minimum requirements for a summary that you would provide. But a lot of people struggle with this, but this is a standard that's in our external standards list. Your external standards list is just a list of standards that you have either bought the standard, you've downloaded the guidance document, it's a regulation that's controlled by one of the regulators that you're compliant with, or it's some other document, like you're a contract manufacturer and your customer gave you that drawing. These are all documents of external origin. But just because it's a document of external origin doesn't mean it automatically goes in a list of harmonized standards for Europe, or a list of recognized standards that you're complying with for the FDA. Only some of those get included. And not just the ones that are applicable, but it might even be smaller lists than that. Just because it's applicable doesn't mean there's a testing requirement in there. That's the bottom line. So yes, everything should be on your external documents list, but then a subset of that has testing requirements, and a subset of that is applicable to your device. So the only ones that really need to be on your 510K submission, or in your declaration of conformity, or your harmonized standards list for that product technical file, are the ones that are applicable to that device, and the ones that have testing requirements. If it doesn't have a testing requirement, it might be in the gray area where you could include it, but it's only going to define what documentation you're supposed to be providing. It's not telling you how to test it. So you're going to have to provide other documentation explaining how you tested it, including protocols and test reports. So I think that kind of covers this topic in general. If anybody has any additional questions about harmonized standards, or does this get included or not, I have come up with lots of times where I've said, this doesn't need to be included, this doesn't say that it needs to be included, and I still have notified body auditors say you need to add this. Not every notified body auditor is always right. Sometimes they make mistakes. So you can push back, and push back politely, and explain, we only include the standards here that are applicable to this device from our external standards list, and we only include the ones that have testing requirements. In our essential requirements checklist, or our GSPR, we've listed additional standards, but we also indicate what we're referencing, such as our ISO certificate. There's no test there. You can push back that way, say this is how we did it. If they're insisting no, that's not acceptable, it might be easier just to comply with what they're asking for. But a lot of times, when I've actually seen this in an audit, where they said, please explain why you didn't include these 6 other standards Well, I can see what the auditor did. What the auditor did is it was a dental submission. They typed in dental, found a whole list of standards that had the word dental in them, and said, "Why didn't you include these?" Well, first of all, it isn't that type of product, so that's why that's not applicable. I just had to go down the list and explain why each one wasn't applicable. But there wasn't really a lot of thought put in it by the auditor. Um, we had provided a list. They thought of some new ones, wanted to know why it wasn't covered because none of those are applicable. So sometimes they're asking the question just to show that they have reviewed potential standards and then saw that they weren't in there and said, why aren't these in there? And pushed it back on you to say, you tell them why it's not included instead of them figuring it out. So be careful. Just because the auditor, just because even the FDA, just because somebody says, why didn't you comply with this, doesn't automatically mean you have to comply with it. If there's not a testing requirement in there, or it's not applicable to your device, you probably shouldn't. I'll give you an example. So, clinical thermometer. Just because you have a device that measures temperature doesn't mean it's a clinical thermometer. So, here's an example. If you have a device that's doing a thermodilution calculation, there are multiple devices that do that. Or if you have a device that's measuring temperature on the skin in a different part of the body. So clinical thermometers, they have specific places on the body that they're supposed to measure body temperature. And there are only certain places that they're going to give you accurate readings. And if you do it in another location, they're going to give you potentially an inaccurate reading. So when you read the standard for clinical thermometers, it tells you in the scope what things it applies to and what things it doesn't. Just because you're measuring temperature doesn't mean it's in the scope of the standard. So you need to read the scope of the standard and say, oh, our device doesn't measure temperature for that purpose. It's not in the scope. And that's your answer. We didn't include that clinical thermometer standard because our device, although it measures temperature, it doesn't measure it for that purpose. And it doesn't measure it in that location. So the accuracy requirement or the range of temperature that it has to measure is different. So we didn't include that. And it might be a much broader range. It might be a much more narrow range. It depends on what you're using it for. It could be the same thing for all kinds of other things. You have to figure out what is the purpose of that standard, what is the scope of that standard, and what does your device do, and does your device fit with that? And if it doesn't, I would leave it out. And if the notified body or the FDA asks why, you provide a very succinct rationale, like the scope of this standard says this, and our device does not fall within that scope, and therefore that's why we didn't include it. Or if it's why didn't you consider listing this standard? It's because that standard doesn't have any testing requirements. Those are two great reasons for not including a standard. And you don't always have to include every single standard you've heard of. So that's the final message that I wanted to leave you with. And I hope that was helpful. If you have any other questions, don't hesitate to put comments down below or shoot me an email. My contact information is on our website as well as on our YouTube channel. There's actually a new video up that explains how to contact us, and I put up a special video just for that, to how to reach me. Oh, somebody put in one more question before we go here. Sometimes it gets confusing to what level of testing studies have to be conducted. Yes, that is correct. So there's a somewhat formal process that we go through for the FDA to figure out what's required. One of those methods is to look to see if there's a guidance document that says what testing should be done. There are European guidance documents that actually say what testing should be done as well. There are also technical file guidance documents that say what should be in a technical file. So you first want to look for those. If they don't have that, then you can, if it's submitting to the US, you can submit a pre-sub with a draft testing plan, even draft protocols, and ask the FDA feedback on on the specific testing plan, if you had questions about acceptance criteria, testing methods, models that you're going to use, like an animal study, making sure you're using an appropriate animal model. You might have to deviate from the normal testing method because of your device has a unique feature that doesn't make it possible to do it the way you would normally do that testing. Those are things that you want to ask questions about to the FDA, and the appropriate method is in a pre-sub. If you don't submit the testing method in detail, so the protocol for that testing, then the FDA may respond with, yes, that's an appropriate standard, but if you want us to give you additional feedback, you'll have to submit your protocol or testing protocol and questions in a supplement. So that means you submit a second pre-sub and you wait even longer for getting an answer there. If you're dealing with Europe, a lot of the European Union notified bodies have been trained, do not provide any consulting. The FDA isn't supposed to provide consulting, neither are the notified bodies. So when you ask them about a clinical study, they can't consult on that clinical study and tell you how to do the study. That's something they're not allowed to do. But they, if you are submitting a draft and asking if it's acceptable, they may be able to give you some feedback. But they have to be very careful about what they're giving feedback on and how they're giving it to make sure they're not providing any consulting. A lot of times, if you have somebody that is a regulatory consultant that is familiar with that kind of device, they'll know what harmonized standards are expected, and they can give you some guidance. But I agree, it is always challenging for companies when you're developing a new product to figure out what tests am I going to have to pass for this. And a lot of times, the way the Europeans work is they have you provide a risk analysis. So you're going to have identify all the risks, and then you're going to indicate what the risk controls are, and you're going to reference testing reports, verification and validation testing, showing that you met your risk controls or showed that the risk controls were complete and adequate and actually reduce the risks. So a lot of times what we're looking for is traceability between hazards and risks that are identified in your risk management file, all the way to your verification and validation testing. And the notified bodies require that risk management file and that traceability matrix. But the FDA, the only time you typically see that is we have a few guidance documents that ask for risk analysis of specific types of risks sometimes. And if you have a de novo, they might ask for a benefit risk analysis. But a lot of times, the only place you're seeing a requirement for risk is two places. One is software. They want software hazards. So that would be IEC 80002-1. That's how to apply 14971 to software risks. And then the second one would be for usability. They're looking for a use-related risk analysis. And I see a lot of companies combining those two risk documents into their regular risk management file. They're part of the file, yes, but they're not part of your FMEA or your fault tree analysis, because you estimate risk differently and risk controls are different for software and usability. And so they generally want those risk analyses separate, or hazard analysis separate. So I hope that helps. Somebody's listening to me while they're driving and enjoying it. I hope I made your drive a little bit more useful. And thank you for the great comments. I hope to see you next week. I'll be posting up later today what the topic is for next week. But if you have any suggestions for topic, don't hesitate to shoot me an email or put it in the discussion section on our YouTube page. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a great weekend. Bye-bye.